Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, one of history's really enduring puzzles. A genuine mystery.
We're looking at the Norse settlements in Greenland.
Right, this community that somehow managed to build this complex, functioning society way, way out there on the absolute edge of the world for almost 500 years.
5 centuries, yeah. And then, poof, they just disappear.
Exactly. Leaving behind these, stone ruins, crumbling farms, churches, and this really eerie silence. It's profoundly unsettling when you think about it.
It really is. I mean, imagine it. You transplant a whole Viking society, farms, families, faith, across the, frankly, terrifying North Atlantic. You maintain links back to Europe, you trade. And then over maybe just a few generations, they're simply gone. No final battle recorded, no, mass grave found that explains everything, just silence.
So the big question, the one that still hangs in the air, what actually happened? Where did they all go?
That's the core of it, isn't it?
And digging into that question, that's exactly our mission for this deep dive. We've gathered a whole stack of your sources articles, the latest research papers, notes straight from archaeological digs, glimpses into texts like the sagas, later European records.
A real mix of evidence.
And we're going to unpack it all with you, piece by piece, layer by layer. This is your deep dive into this incredible story, the vanished Vikings of Greenland. We want to go beyond just the basic facts.
Yeah, beyond the simple timeline.
And really explore the history, the environment they were up against, their culture, the economics that kind of held it all together, or maybe didn't in the end, all to try and understand how this seemingly tough, established community could just vanish.
And we have some fascinating angles here. We'll look at the very beginning, this bold vision driven by, well, the legendary Erik the Red.
Can't talk about Greenland without him.
Absolutely not. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of daily life. What was it really like on this Arctic frontier?
Yeah, the survival aspect.
Then there's this really compelling, fairly recent idea about their economy. Maybe not what we always thought. Centered around walrus ivory.
That's a big one. We'll definitely dig into that.
And finally, we have to look at why they disappeared. The likely culprits, this convergence of threats, climate change hitting hard, their economy falling apart, maybe cultural choices playing a role.
It's definitely not a simple story, is it? No single smoking gun.
Not at all. It's a complex puzzle, and that's what makes it so enduringly fascinating.
Okay, let's start unpacking this historical enigma. And like so many of these big Viking stories, it really kicks off with a bit of trouble, maybe more than a bit, and a truly larger-than-life figure, Erik the Red.
Indeed. Erik Thorvaldsson, born over in Norway, Jæren region, probably around 950 A.D. And trouble seemed to, well, run in the family almost from the start.
Oh, how so?
Well, his father, Thorvald Asleson, was a chieftain himself, and perhaps setting a pattern, he got himself exiled from Norway. For murder.
So maybe a tendency towards, let's say, forceful conflict resolution was hereditary.
It certainly seems Erik might have inherited some of that. He grew up in Iceland, where the family fled after the Norway banishment, and he quickly got a reputation.
For what? A fiery temper?
Exactly, a hot temper, prone to violence. And that reputation eventually landed him in hot water in Iceland, too. In 982 A.D., there was some kind of dispute. He killed 2 men.
So consequences.
Yeah, banishment again, this time from Iceland, for 3 years.
And instead of just laying low for 3 years?
Right, most people might have. But Erik, during this forced exile, he decides to go exploring. Sails west from Iceland, out into the unknown waters of the North Atlantic, and bam, he finds this huge, uncharted landmass.
Which he calls Greenland. Now, anyone who's seen a picture of Greenland today, mostly ice sheet, green isn't the first word that springs to mind.
Definitely not. So the name itself, that sparked a lot of debate, why call it that? And our sources offer a couple of main theories, both pretty interesting.
Okay, what's the leading theory?
The most common one, the one you hear most often, paints Erik as, well, a brilliant marketer, maybe even a bit deceptive. Iceland at the time. It was getting crowded. Norse settlement had really taken off there. Erik needed people. He needed settlers for his new discovery. He had to convince folks to leave their homes, risk a really dangerous sea journey, and start fresh in this distant, harsh land.
So calling it Greenland
made it sound much more inviting, fertile, habitable than, say, mostly Iceland or really cold, rocky fjord land. It was basically a clever piece of branding, a marketing ploy to recruit colonists. He was selling a dream.
A medieval real estate developer. Make the brochure look good. But you said there's another theory, one that suggests it wasn't all just marketing spin.
Right. This other theory connects to the climate at the time. We have to remember the Earth was in what's called the medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1300 AD.
Okay, so globally warmer than it is now or was later.
Generally, yes. And in Greenland, this likely meant the climate, especially along the coast where they settled, was a bit milder than today. Crucially, glaciers would likely have receded further back from the immediate coastline.
Exposing more land, more vegetation.
Exactly. More vegetation along the fjords, maybe greener patches. So it's quite plausible that the specific areas they first landed in and chose for their settlements did look genuinely greener, or at least had more usable pasture land and vegetation than they do today or did later during the Little Ice Age.
And the archaeology backs this up somewhat, finding settlements where it seems tough to live now.
It does. The very existence of these substantial farmsteads, the foundations of large buildings in areas that seem marginal now, suggests those locations offered better conditions back then, better microclimates, more usable land during that warmer phase.
So maybe a bit of marketing genius, maybe reflecting a temporary greener reality, or probably a mix of both.
That seems most likely. A combination. And whatever the reason, the name, the pitch, it worked. Erik goes back to Iceland in 985 AD, his banishment over, and he's incredibly persuasive.
He gets people to sign up.
He does. A lot of people.
Yeah.
Estimates vary, but maybe around 300 people packed into maybe 25 ships, willing to follow him on this incredibly ambitious, frankly dangerous quest to settle Greenland.
And that journey itself, not exactly a pleasure cruise.
No way. The sources stress how brutal the North Atlantic crossing was.
Yeah.
Terrible conditions, storms. Historical accounts suggest maybe nearly half the ships, half the people were lost on that initial voyage.
Wow, that's a huge loss. But they still made it. Enough of them.
Enough made it. Despite those horrendous losses, they reached Greenland's southwestern coast, and they established themselves. They founded two main settlement areas tucked away in deep fjords for shelter and slightly better conditions.
The eastern settlement and the western settlement?
Those are the ones. Strategically chosen locations offering pockets of usable land.
And it's important to remember, these weren't just temporary camps, right? They were building for the long haul.
Absolute critical point. The sagas like Eirik's saga, Raua, Erik the Red's saga, they paint him as this powerful, determined leader, maybe stubborn too. A skilled navigator, yes, but his goal was colonization, permanent settlement.
Recreating their world?
Exactly. They were building farms, proper longhouses, churches, trying to replicate the Scandinavian life they knew, but on this remote, incredibly demanding Arctic frontier. They weren't just scraping by initially. They were building a society.
Okay, so they pull off this amazing feat. They establish permanent communities. They've got the leader, the people, the drive. But what was life actually like day to day, century after century, living on the edge like that? Let's get into the realities of survival and society.
Yeah, because life in Greenland, from Erik's time right through the nearly 500 years they were there, it was relentlessly tough. The sources hammer this home. Harsh weather, limited resources, always a challenge.
And they came over expecting to live like Europeans, right? Farming, raising animals.
They did. They brought their whole agricultural package with them, tried to grow barley, raise sheep, goats, even cattle, which are really demanding animals in terms of fodder, just like back home in Norway or Iceland.
But Greenland wasn't Norway or Iceland.
Not even close, agriculturally speaking. The sources are really clear on this. Even during the warmer period, it was marginal at best. Growing seasons were incredibly short. The soil often thin and poor.
So crop failures were common.
Frequent and unpredictable.
Yeah.
They could get some harvests in the most sheltered fjord areas, but you just couldn't rely on it to feed everyone consistently. It wasn't a stable foundation.
Which means they had to look elsewhere for food. Hunting and fishing weren't just extras, they were essential.
Absolutely essential. Not just supplements, but the bedrock of their survival. They hunted seals constantly. Seals were vital. Meat, obviously protein and fat, are critical in that environment, but also blubber for oil, for lamps, for heating, and hides for clothing, boots, ropes, kayak coverings perhaps. Seals were a cornerstone resource.
And fishing too.
Oh yes, the coastal waters were rich. Cod, other species. Marine resources were fundamental from day one. They had to be good hunters and fishers, or become good very quickly to make it work in Greenland.
Now, they weren't alone on this massive island, were they? There were already people living there.
Correct. Our sources mention the presence of indigenous peoples. Primarily, during the Norse period, the Inuit, specifically the Thule culture, who were actually migrating south into Greenland from the Canadian Arctic around the same time the Norse were settling the southwest. And before them, the Dorset culture, who had been there for thousands of years but seemed to have largely vanished before major Norse-Inuit contact.
So how did the Norse get along with the Inuit, the Thule people?
It seems to have been complex, and it probably changed over time and from place to place. Initially, there's archaeological hints and later saga accounts suggesting periods of, well, maybe cautious coexistence, some interaction, including trade.
What kind of trade?
The Norse had iron tools, maybe some textiles, things the Inuit didn't produce. The Inuit had furs, sealskins, and crucially ivory walrus, or maybe narwhal, which the Norse valued. So some exchange happened.
Did the Norse learn anything from them? I mean, the Inuit were masters of Arctic survival.
You'd think so, right? They had incredibly sophisticated technology and knowledge for Arctic living kayaks, umiaks, toggle harpoons, dog sleds, techniques for hunting on ice, building snow houses, things the Norse didn't have. There's evidence they learned some things, probably related to seal hunting or navigating local waters. But the extent is debated.
Why debate it? Why wouldn't they adopt everything that worked?
Well, the sources also point to periods of friction, hostility, even violence. The Norse brought their European mindset, strong social hierarchy, Christianity, a sense often of cultural superiority. They sometimes try to convert the Inuit, which likely caused tension.
And competition for resources?
Almost certainly. As the Thule Inuit expanded south into the same fjord systems the Norse occupied, there would have been competition for hunting grounds, especially for seals and caribou. And the Norse sagas sometimes referred to the Inuit dismissively as skraelings, which basically means wretches or savages. That reflects a clear cultural divide and prejudice that could easily flare into conflict.
So a really challenging environment, difficult farming, complex relations with their neighbors. Yet they didn't just barely hang on. You said they built a sophisticated society.
They really did, considering the isolation. They established these organized communities, distinct farms, impressive stone churches, even a bishopric with a cathedral at Gardar in the eastern settlement. That shows a deep commitment to their European identity and faith.
And they weren't totally cut off. They maintained contact with Europe.
For centuries, yes. They kept up trade routes, mainly with Norway, their mother country, effectively. They needed to import things they couldn't make. Iron was absolutely critical for tools and weapons, timber for building, and especially for ship repair. Luxury goods, too.
And they paid for this how? What did Greenland have that Europe wanted?
A few things. Rare white falcons for hunting, maybe some polar bear pelts.
Yeah.
But the big one, the really valuable export, seems to have been walrus ivory.
Walrus ivory. Okay, this brings us to that revised perspective you mentioned earlier, the idea that maybe ivory wasn't just an export, but the export.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where recent archaeology and rereading of historical texts offers a potentially game-changing insight. The traditional view was, farmers who get some hunting on the side to supplement things and get trade goods.
Right.
But the newer thinking, supported by quite a bit of evidence now, flips that script. It argues they weren't farmers first to hunt occasionally. They might well have been ivory hunters first and foremost. And the farms were essentially the support system, the logistical base needed to sustain that incredibly valuable long-distance ivory trade.
Okay, hang on. That really changes things. Why would they go to all the trouble of that lethal sea crossing, settling a marginal land just to farm poorly? It never quite added up, did it?
It didn't fully make sense as the primary motivation, no. But if the real prize was walrus ivory, now that's different. Why? Because in medieval Europe, walrus tusks were like gold. Hugely valuable.
What made them so valuable?
They were used for luxury goods, carved into exquisite chess pieces, religious objects like crosses and reliquaries, decorative items, knife handles. Think of it as a low-bulk, high-value commodity. Easier to ship across the Atlantic than, say, tons of dried fish or hides, but worth a fortune at the other end.
And the Vikings knew about walrus hunting already.
Oh, yes. The sources point out that they'd actually hunted walruses pretty much to extinction around Iceland before they even got to Greenland. So they knew the value, they knew how to hunt them, and when they arrived in Greenland,
They found loads of them.
bingo, abundant herds, especially way up north, far from their main settlements, in places like Disco Bay on the west coast, hundreds of miles north.
Disco Bay, so getting there wasn't just a quick trip down the fjord.
Not at all. We're talking a serious expedition.
Yeah.
Disco Bay is roughly 600 miles north of the eastern settlement, maybe 300 miles north of the western settlement. These weren't casual hunting trips.
So how did it work? Who went?
It required major organization. Good, seaworthy ships, probably NARs, their cargo vessels. Skilled crews. Significant planning. The sources suggest it was likely parties of young, able-bodied men drawn from different farms across the settlements who made this trek north every summer.
A communal effort, then.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
Had to be. We even have mentions in texts suggesting the journey times like 27 days sailing one way from the eastern settlement, 15 days from the western. That's a huge chunk of the short summer season dedicated just to travel, let alone the hunt itself.
So different farms probably pooled resources, provided men, boats, supplies.
That's the thinking. It was a collective enterprise, vital for the entire colony's economy. Everyone had a stake in its success.
And what did they bring back? Just the tusks?
Primarily the most valuable parts to save space and weight on the ships. They definitely took the hides. Walrus hide was incredibly tough, prized for making strong ropes, especially rigging for their ships, and of course the tusks. But interestingly, not necessarily the whole skull.
Oh, why not? Too heavy.
Exactly. Getting the tusks out of the massive skull is hard work. So the archaeology within the settlements themselves, back at the farms, has turned up huge amounts of these things called walrus maxilla chips.
Maxilla chips? What are they?
They're small, very dense fragments of bone from the upper jaw, the maxilla, right where the tusks are embedded. Finding lots of these chips back in the settlements suggests that the final, laborious process of extracting the tusks happened there, not necessarily at the hunting grounds hundreds of miles away.
Ah, so they brought back the front part of the skull with the tusks still in it.
That seems likely. Bring back the valuable bit, process it at home base, closer to where it would be stored, maybe initially worked, and eventually loaded for export. It shows how central this activity was to life in the settlements, not just far away.
And the value.
Yeah.
You said it was immense.
Truly staggering. The sources mention one specific document, an account from Norway dated 1327. It details the value of a single boatload of tusks, harvested from about 260 walruses. That one shipment was recorded as being worth more than all the woolen cloth Iceland's main export that Iceland sent as its church tithe to the Norwegian king over a period of 6 years.
Wow. One boatload from Greenland worth more than 6 years of Iceland's main tax payment.
Precisely. It just hammers home how incredibly lucrative this trade was. Walrus ivory was Greenland's oil, its diamonds. It was the economic engine that paid for the iron, the timber, everything they needed from Europe and couldn't produce themselves.
So this revised view really flips the narrative. They weren't farmers struggling on the side with hunting. They were specialist hunters and traders of a luxury good who farmed to support that primary venture.
That's the compelling argument from the recent research.
Yep.
The lure of ivory drew them there. The profits kept them connected to Europe for centuries. The farms were necessary infrastructure, but maybe secondary.
But that reliance on one incredibly valuable resource, however crucial it was for their success,
Also made them incredibly vulnerable. When that engine sputtered or failed entirely, their whole way of life was suddenly in jeopardy. It might have been key not just to their survival, but also, ironically, to their eventual disappearance.
which brings us right back to the core mystery. Why did they vanish? After almost 5 centuries of clinging on, adapting, building the society, why did it all end? We know it wasn't one single, sudden catastrophe.
Right. No Pompeii-style eruption, no evidence of a massive final battle. The consensus now, based on all the evidence, is that it wasn't one thing. It was a deadly combination, a convergence of factors that slowly, or maybe not so slowly towards the end, overwhelmed them by the early 15th century.
Okay, let's break down the main theories the sources present, starting with the one everyone talks about, climate change.
This is almost universally accepted as a major player. Around 1300 AD, things started to shift. The relatively mild conditions of the medieval warm period began to give way to a colder phase. We call it the Little Ice Age.
Little Ice Age. Sounds ominous for people living in Greenland.
It was. Now, the term Little Ice Age covers several centuries, and its effects varied. But for a community already living right on the edge of agricultural possibility, even relatively small drops in average temperature had huge consequences.
And the sources mention a possible trigger for this cooling, something that kicked it off or made it worse.
Yes, there's strong evidence linking the onset, or at least a significant intensification, of this cooling phase to a massive volcanic eruption on the other side of the world. Lombok, Indonesia, in 1257 AD.
1257. How did an Indonesian volcano affect Greenland?
It was a colossal eruption, one of the biggest in millennia. It blasted truly enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide gas high into the stratosphere. These aerosols formed a kind of veil around the planet, reflecting sunlight back into space,
Cooling the whole Earth.
causing a measurable drop in global temperatures for several years afterwards. And many scientists believe this event might have been enough to tip the climate system, especially in the sensitive North Atlantic region, into the colder, more unstable regime of the Little Ice Age over the following decades.
Okay, so colder temperatures hit Greenland. What were the direct impacts on the Norse way of life?
Devastating. First, farming. The already short growing seasons got even shorter, colder, making it increasingly difficult, then likely impossible, to reliably grow hay for winter fodder for their animals, or even the hardiest barley for themselves. Crop failures became the norm, not the exception.
So their livestock suffered, their own food security from farming collapsed.
Exactly. And second, maybe even more critically, sea ice. Colder temperatures meant more sea ice forming in the North Atlantic and lasting longer each year. Especially the stories, the drift ice coming down Greenland's east coast and curling around the southern tip right across the shipping lanes to Europe.
Making the journey to Norway or Iceland even more dangerous than it already was.
Much more dangerous, and eventually probably impassable for the types of ships they had for long stretches of the year, or maybe even for years at a time during particularly bad periods. It effectively choked off their lifeline, their connection to trade, to supplies, to news, to people.
Is there physical evidence for this shift in the archaeology?
Yes, quite dramatically in the skeletal remains. Scientists analyzed the isotopes' chemical signatures in human bones found in Norse graves. These isotopes reflect the diet people ate.
And what do they show?
A very clear trend over time. In the earlier centuries, the Norse diet included a significant amount of food from land animals, sheep, goats, maybe some cattle, caribou. But as you move towards the later periods, the 14th and 15th centuries,
What happens?
the proportion of marine food in their diet skyrockets. By the very end, analyses suggest seals, overwhelmingly seals, made up as much as 80% of the protein they consumed.
80%. So they basically stopped eating their farm animals.
It strongly suggests the farms were failing. Pastures couldn't support the livestock, or they were slaughtering them because they couldn't feed them through the winter. They were forced to rely almost entirely on hunting from the sea. Hunting seals in increasingly icy, dangerous waters. It's stark evidence of environmental pressure forcing adaptation or desperation.
Okay, so the climate turns hostile, undermining their food base and cutting them off physically. That leads directly into the second big theory, isolation and economic collapse.
They go hand in hand. As the sea ice worsened, those vital voyages to and from Europe became rarer, more perilous, maybe eventually ceased altogether for long periods. Communication dwindled.
And their main partner, Norway, wasn't exactly in great shape either.
No. Norway, which claimed sovereignty over Greenland and was their main trade link, was going through its own problems in the 14th century. Political instability, plagues, eventually merging with Denmark under a single crown. Their focus and resources were likely elsewhere, not on supporting a distant, increasingly inaccessible, and probably less profitable colony.
Less profitable, that connects to the ivory market, right?
Absolutely. This is a massive blow, perhaps the killer blow economically. Just as Greenland was becoming harder to reach, the bottom fell out of the market for their main export, walrus ivory.
Why? What happened in Europe?
New competition arrived. European powers, particularly Portugal, were opening up sea routes down the coast of Africa, and they started bringing back large quantities of elephant ivory.
Elephant ivory, how did that compare?
It was often seen as superior. Larger tusks, maybe easier to carve, didn't yellow as much over time. And with these new direct trade routes, it became more readily available, possibly cheaper. The fashion in Europe shifted away from walrus ivory towards elephant ivory.
So the demand for Greenland's main product just collapsed.
It seems so. Suddenly, their currency, the high-value item they relied on to trade for essentials, lost much of its value. There was less incentive for European merchants to risk the dangerous voyage to Greenland if they couldn't sell the ivory for a high profit back home.
And if the ships stopped coming?
The supply lines were severed. No more iron for tools, knives, nails, weapons, no more timber for building houses, repairing boats. These were things that Greenland Norse absolutely could not produce themselves. They were totally dependent on imports. Without that trade, their technology, their infrastructure, their entire European way of life became unsustainable.
And wasn't there another factor weakening Europe, especially Norway around this time? The Black Death?
Yes, a devastating factor. The plague itself, the Black Death, doesn't seem to have reached Greenland. They were too isolated, thankfully for them in that respect. But it ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century. Norway was hit incredibly hard. Some estimates suggest maybe half its population died.
Its population?
That's staggering. And this catastrophe would have massively weakened Norway, their primary connection. Fewer ships, fewer sailors, less administrative capacity, less demand for luxury goods. It further crippled the very society that was Greenland's lifeline.
It paints a picture of them being victims of things happening thousands of miles away. Globalization, medieval style, a changing climate, a shifting global trade, a pandemic in a distant land.
Exactly. It highlights how interconnected things were even then. The sources really suggest that while they were incredibly resilient, they'd survived for centuries. They might have weathered one of these crises alone, maybe just the climate change or just the economic shift. But the combination, hitting them all around the same time, that seems to have been overwhelming.
Climate change, economic collapse, isolation, a devastating trifecta. But there's a third major theory the sources discuss, one that looks inward at the Norse themselves. The idea of a failure to adapt, or maybe a cultural blind spot.
This is a more controversial angle, perhaps, but one that some scholars emphasize. The argument is that despite living in Greenland for nearly 500 years, the Norse remained culturally quite conservative. They seemed to cling stubbornly to their European identity and practices,
Like what specifically?
continuing to invest heavily in farming, trying to raise cattle and sheep, even when the environment was clearly screaming that this wasn't working well. Building large stone churches in the European style, which required immense resources in terms of labor and imported timber for roofing, maintaining their traditional social structures.
And the argument is this conservatism stopped them from fully embracing better ways to survive in the Arctic, ways the Inuit knew.
That's part of it. As we touched on, while there was some interaction, maybe some learning, there seems to have been a reluctance or maybe a refusal to fully adopt the really sophisticated Arctic survival toolkit of the Inuit.
Like the kayaks and harpoons.
Exactly. Kayaks for efficient seal hunting in open water and among ice floes. Toggle harpoons, which were much more effective at securing wounded seals than Norse spears or arrows. Dog sleds for winter travel. Techniques for building warmer winter dwellings, perhaps. Why didn't they adopt these wholesale?
Cultural pride, prejudice.
Possibly a combination. That sense of European Christian superiority, looking down on the Inuit as scralings or heathens, a deep-seated desire to remain Norse, not go native. Adopting Inuit ways might have felt like abandoning their identity.
Some sources also mention their diet remaining stubbornly European, wanting beef and dairy when it wasn't really viable.
That argument is made, suggesting a rigidity in food preferences. However, this is where it gets complicated, and the evidence is a bit conflicting, as we noted.
Right, the bone isotopes they were eating mostly seals by the end.
Precisely. That isotopic evidence clearly shows a massive dietary adaptation towards marine resources, mainly seals. So they were eating what was available. They weren't starving because they refused to eat seal meat while waiting for a non-existent cow.
So the failure to adapt is maybe more nuanced, not about what they ate but how they got it or other cultural aspects.
That seems more likely. Perhaps the adaptation was incomplete. They adapted their diet out of necessity, but maybe not their hunting technology to make getting that food more efficient or reliable in the worsening conditions. Or maybe they failed to adapt their social structure or their reliance on the European trade model, which had become unsustainable.
So not a total failure, but maybe a critical lack of adaptation in certain key areas, possibly held back by their strong sense of cultural identity. They wanted to remain European Christians in a place where that was becoming impossible.
That's a strong possibility. Their identity, their connection to Europe, their faith, these were core to who they were. When Greenland could no longer support that identity, maybe leaving or simply failing to thrive became the outcome.
Okay, so we have this perfect storm. Climate disaster, economic ruin, isolation, possibly hampered by cultural choices. What was the final act? Did they all just die out in Greenland? Starve? Freeze? Or did they pack up and leave?
This is the crux of the debate right now among the archaeologists and historians studying this. Everyone agrees the pressures were immense. But how the end came extinction on the island versus gradual emigration, that's where interpretations of the evidence differ.
Let's look at the extinction argument first. Who makes that case and based on what?
Researchers like Thomas McGovern have argued strongly for a tragic scenario of extinction within Greenland. He really emphasizes the community's vulnerability.
Because they were so small?
Exactly. We're talking maybe 2,500 people at their absolute peak, spread across two main settlement areas. By the end, that number could have been down to 1,000, maybe even fewer. That's a tiny population base to withstand major shocks.
And concentrated in those fjords. Plus, you mentioned the men being away hunting.
Right. Those crucial summer walrus hunts took a large proportion of the young, fit men far away from home for extended periods. This left the settlements potentially more vulnerable and also meant the loss of a single hunting party at sea could be demographically catastrophic.
Especially as the weather got worse with the Little Ice Age, more storms.
Precisely. McGovern points out the increased risk of sudden, large-scale losses at sea. He compares it to things like the Shetland fishing disaster in 1881, where one storm wiped out a huge chunk of the male population of small islands with devastating long-term consequences. Imagine a few bad years like that in Greenland.
What would happen?
The argument is if the population dropped below a certain critical level, maybe through accidents, maybe disease, maybe a few consecutive really bad winters causing starvation, they simply wouldn't have enough people left to mount the large coordinated hunts needed to feed everyone, especially with farming gone. The communal system collapses.
Leading to a downward spiral.
A fatal spiral. Not enough hunters, less food, more weakness, starvation, even fewer people, societal collapse, and eventual extinction.
What about the lack of records? If they left, wouldn't someone in Iceland or Norway have written it down?
That's a key point for the extinction argument. Iceland and Norway were literate societies. They kept records, annals, sagas. If suddenly hundreds or even 1,000 Greenland refugees turned up on their shores in the early 1400s, surely, the argument goes, that would have been a major event. Someone would have recorded it. The silence in the Icelandic and Norwegian records is seen by some as evidence they never arrived because they died in Greenland.
Okay, that sounds plausible. But there's a counter-argument for emigration.
Yes, a strong one, championed by researchers like Niels Lennerup and Jet Arneborg. They suggest the end wasn't sudden or catastrophic. It was a slow, gradual dwindling. Emigration, not extinction.
How would that work? People just drifting away?
Kind of. As conditions got tougher, as the trade dried up, as life became harder over generations, people simply made the choice to leave. Maybe a family decided to try their luck back in Iceland. Maybe a boatload went to Norway. Small groups trickling away over decades.
And that kind of slow trickle wouldn't necessarily make headlines back home.
Exactly. A few families arriving here and there might easily blend into the population without specific mention in the annals. Unlike a sudden mass arrival of desperate refugees, it would be much less visible historically.
What archaeological evidence supports this orderly departure idea?
Several key things. First, as we mentioned, there's generally a lack of widespread evidence for violent conflict with the Inuit in the final layers of the Norse sites.
Yeah.
No signs of settlements being overrun or destroyed in battle.
Okay.
Second, the sites themselves often look abandoned rather than overwhelmed by disaster. No signs of intentional destruction or burning, which you might expect if they were wiped out by attackers or internal strife.
And the missing valuables.
This is perhaps the most compelling point for the emigration argument. Archaeologists consistently find a striking lack of valuable portable artifacts in the final occupation layers. Where are the good iron swords, the silver brooches, the valuable tools, the religious items like chalices or crucifixes?
Things people would definitely take with them if they were leaving.
Exactly. If people were simply starving to death or dying of disease en masse, you'd expect to find more of these personal, valuable items left behind in the houses. Their absence strongly suggests people packed up their most important belongings and took them when they departed. You don't carefully pack your bags if you're dying in place.
Are there specific examples? Like that farm you mentioned?
Yes, the farm beneath the sands excavation is often cited. It's a site in the western settlement that got buried by sand relatively quickly after it was abandoned, preserving it well. In one building, archaeologists found a room where the door was still closed. The room itself was swept clean. No animal bones scattered around, no signs that sheep or goats had wandered in after the humans left.
Suggesting someone tied it up before they left.
That's Jet Arneborg's interpretation. It looks like a deliberate, orderly closure. They took what mattered, maybe secured the place as best they could, and left. It doesn't look like a scene of chaos, starvation, or sudden death.
This ties back to the cultural identity thing too, doesn't it? Maybe leaving was the only way to remain Norse.
That's a powerful part of the immigration theory. They saw themselves as European farmers, Christians, part of the Norse world. When Greenland became a place where they could no longer sustain that life, no reliable farming, churches falling into disrepair, no trade link to Europe, maybe increasing pressure from the Inuit, perhaps the only way to preserve their identity was to leave.
Like the analogy with colonists in America not becoming buffalo hunters.
Right. Niels Lennerup uses that comparison. Why didn't European colonists just adopt indigenous lifestyles entirely? Because their goal was to recreate their own society. When Greenland stopped being compatible with Norse society, leaving might have seemed the only culturally acceptable option for those who could manage it, rather than fully assimilating into an Inuit way of life, which would have meant abandoning their fundamental identity.
So whether it was a tragic end in Greenland due to collapsing systems or a slow, unrecorded departure as people sought to remain Norse elsewhere, we know they were gone by the early 1400s. What's the absolute last trace we have?
The very last concrete historical mention comes from church records, specifically a wedding.
A wedding? In Greenland?
Yes. Recorded as taking place at the still-standing church at Halsey in the eastern settlement in the year 1408. We know about this because documents relating to it, likely letters or official papers, circulated back in Iceland and Norway.
So proof of life in 1408.
Definitive proof that the community, at least in the eastern settlement, was still functioning, holding Christian ceremonies, recording legal events in 1408. These documents related to the wedding continued to be known or referenced until about 1424. And after that, silence. That's the last confirmed contact.
But there's a crucial detail about that wedding couple, isn't there? Sigrid and Thorstein.
Yes. This is incredibly significant. The sources note that this very couple, Sigrid Jornsdottir and Thorstein Olafsson, who got married in Greenland in 1408, are later recorded as having arrived and settled in Iceland.
They made it out.
They made it out. It's cast iron proof that travel was still possible, that at least some people left Greenland and successfully reintegrated into the Norse world elsewhere, even at that late stage.
That really tips the balance towards emigration being at least part of the story, doesn't it?
It makes a pure extinction scenario where absolutely everyone died in Greenland, much harder to maintain. It doesn't prove everyone left or that there wasn't also terrible hardship and death for many who stayed, but it proves the exit door wasn't completely sealed. It leaves open that intriguing possibility that others followed, perhaps unrecorded, and maybe, just maybe, descendants of the Greenland Vikings are walking around Iceland or Norway today, completely unaware of their connection to this vanished Arctic colony.
Wow. Just thinking back over everything we've dug into from the sources. Erik the Red's sheer audacity, the brutal reality of life there, that surprising twist about the ivory economy being the main driver, and then this complex tangle of reasons for the disappearance, climate, economy, isolation culture.
It really underscores how many things went wrong for them, seemingly all at once or in rapid succession.
It wasn't just one domino falling, it was like the whole row collapsed. The climate change hitting their farming and their travel, the bottom dropping out of the ivory market, wrecking their economy, being cut off from vital supplies, and maybe being hampered by their own cultural inertia, their understandable desire to remain who they were.
A true perfect storm. It really hits home, doesn't it? The sources paint this picture of incredible resilience for centuries, followed by this convergence of pressures that ultimately proved too much.
It feels like a really chilling lesson from the past about how fragile even tough established societies can be when the environmental and economic ground shifts beneath their feet too quickly or too severely.
It really does, and it resonates today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This story from 600 years ago touches on so many themes we grapple with now. Adapting to climate change, the vulnerability of economies dependent on global trade or single resources, the impact of isolation versus connection, the choices cultures make between tradition and adaptation for survival.
They face their own versions of climate shocks, global market disruptions, maybe even the distant effects of a pandemic crippling your main partner. It's eerily relevant.
Those silent ruins in Greenland, the ghost towns, they really do feel like they're whispering a warning across the centuries about the challenges of interconnectedness and the choices we face when our world changes.
So as you think about this whole saga, what stands out most to you? Is it the ambition of the settlement, the toughness of their lives, the surprising power of walrus ivory, or the complex, still debated reasons for why they ultimately vanished?
Something to ponder. What part of this deep dive into the Greenland Norse story resonates most with you?
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.